Hello, Matt. Good to have you back again.
Thank you, Karen, for having me back. Say, Karen, I have a question for you.
Well, that's a novelty. I'm usually bugging you with all my questions.
Before we pressed record, I had asked you for an update, or shall I say, the best stories are told in media res at the beginning, in the midst of things. So I asked for not a snapshot, not an introduction, but just give me the midst of things for your thoughts on computation, complexity, and the theory of the world. And then you began to tell me about certain people you've been reading and certain ideas you've been synthesizing. And then I said, wait, let's put the park on. I'd love for this to be recorded because I want to hear it again. So do you mind now bringing us up to speed?
Okay, so I was telling you that I've been looking at Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything, and people who've been watching know that I have a couple of short solo videos where I've attempted to go bit by bit through his description of the theory. But since you didn't get a chance to see those, I'll just tell you that the basic idea, when you get to the end of his video, he says that the basic idea is that the universe is, and he's making up words here because there are no words that can explain this. The universe is a ruliad, and a ruliad is the space of all possible rules. And all possible computations are being played or exhibited on all these possible rules. And one of the things that falls out from that for him is that he feels that Einstein, well, at least one of the things that shows up in his theory is that Einstein's theory of a space-time continuum is not a part of his theory. Wolfram's theory shows that space and time are separate. And I can't remember what he said about time, but I remember that he said space is discrete. Space is not continuous. And so in all of this, he's using the language of computers, but I don't think he really means computers. I think he is speaking, using this as an image or an analog of what the universe might look like. And when he says that space is discrete, he's talking about these various nodes. And in order to do this, I need to show you Rule 30, because this is an example of a very simple rule that can become very complex. So can you see that?
Yes.
Well, and of course it disappeared. Okay, so Rule 30 starts out as a very simple rule, and the rule is just you have one cell, one black cell on a line of white cells, and based on what's next to it, that tells it what changes to make in the next iteration. So Rule 30 is a very simple rule. All these iterations start to get made, and over time, it starts to look like this. It becomes very, very complex, completely unpredictable. It's computationally irreducible, meaning that there's no way to predict what it's going to be like in X number of days or in X number of years. You just have to play the whole program out to find out what happens.
Even though you stated the rules governing the behavior in less than 2 minutes.
Yes, well, I mean, this rule is very simple. I didn't give you the rule, but it's very simple. It's like, let's say, this is just an example. If to the left of you, there's a white square, then you duplicate yourself in the next row or something like that. Some simple rule. So this is Rule 30. There's another one called Rule 110 that he really likes. Here's Rule 110. You can see this very, very complex but orderly border takes place up here along the edge.
Mhm.
Then this other thing falls out that just gets more and more complex as it goes, right? So there's slices of order in here, and then there's all this complexity. And so when he first started out, he thought maybe that the universe is composed of one simple rule.
Mhm.
But over time, he's come to the conclusion that it's actually all possible rules. And when he says that the universe is fundamentally computational, he's not saying that we are a simulation, but a computation, as I understand, when Glenn, the physicist, explains this to me, a computation is a choice. 1 or 0 or 1, up or down, forward or back.
Mhm.
Every time we make a choice, that's a computation. So another way to look at computation is when a key fits into a lock. When it fits, then it turns and it can open the lock.
And notice in that example with the lock and key, you're speaking situationally, and that is analogous to your first example with the pyramidal structure of the if-then statement.
Mhm.
If you come to this turn and it's white, then you turn.
Mhm.
The element of doing the action, let alone however you got in that situation, parameterized by the rule, is those two things. The one, action, and the other, the context of that action. So we see choice and free choice, choice with consequence, but all of that tied in, not in some simulation, some unreality, but in a briefly described but accurately represented condition. But then you said all possible arrangements
Mhm.
of condition. Would you say more about that?
Well, it's interesting that you asked the question that way, because I've also been reading Matthieu Pageau's book, The Language of Creation. And he does this interesting thing with space and time, where they map onto a lot of different things. But just for now, I'm just going to talk about the idea of discrete and continuous. Matthieu says that space is discrete and time is continuous. And you wouldn't think, well, why is that so important? But space is also representative of heaven, and time is representative of, I believe he has time representative of earth. But the main thing is this idea between discrete and continuous is discrete is incomplete. Continuous is complete. So if you think about a binary, or not even a binary, but just a line, an infinite line. You were talking in one of your emails about Zeno's paradox and how
Yep.
you get immobilized in Zeno's paradox. You can't move because every move is an infinite step. And so you never get anywhere. That's the problem with completeness. If every single point on the line is included, then you don't have any meaning, and
Precisely.
you get immobilized because there's no way to make a choice when there's too many probabilities and possibilities. But this is why we have male and female, for example, rather than gender fluidity, because gender fluidity removes all the potential, because the potential comes out of making choices. Action is necessary for the creation of order. And action can only take place on a binary. Yes or no, move or don't move, left or right, up or down. So every choice is a choice to commit or not commit. And that's where creativity happens. So it requires incompleteness, right?
Yeah.
that require, when you think about that, everything falls out of that. Judgment and discernment fall out of that because you have to choose for some things and against other things because you can't include everything. It gets into what Jonathan is always talking about with how it's necessary to have the margins, because you have to move some things out of the completeness out to the margins in order to have incompleteness, because without incompleteness, you can't have any creativity.
Exactly. That I think we should sit with that for another 5 minutes, because the discoveries of the 21st century will not be novelties out there. They will be the obvious things here. As Jean-Yves Lacasse said, who is one of the contemporary exemplars of the phenomenological turn in France, who wrote the book Experience in the Absolute in the 1980s and is now being translated into the English and other languages. The most obvious things in philosophy, or the most obvious things in thought, are the last to be explicitly conceptualized. It's the reverse order of things. And his example or illustration was the discovery of topology in algebraic geometry in 1920, roughly speaking. The Klein bottle, for example, where the inner is the outer and the outer is the inner, not by pure speculation or statements of fiat. It is because it is, or it has to be because we want inclusion. So it wasn't predicated on a desire with extrinsic motivations or anything else. It was demonstrated according to some axioms, according to some unfolding of propositions that had more in them than we thought possible, given a brief statement. In other words, exactly what you pinpointed and presented earlier with that clear wall and then that avalanche of a slope from the same if-then conditional statement. Mm-hmm. And notice how you said, well, if we have this rule and then we have that avatar enacting the rule, then we get this. This wasn't either one of those. It was similar to an artwork. It was a manifestation of, that's the question. What is this kind of art demonstrating? And so the most obvious things, the things closest to hand, are the last to be explicitly conceptualized. And so he brought topology forward as an example of there is space. We've talked about that even before Einstein. Immanuel Kant in Transcendental Idealism spoke of space. But we also have this thing which we all acknowledge implicitly: place. No matter where you are, you are in a place. And to use your word, that place is not continuous because we go from place to place. It shows its discrete nature. And so as topology was developed through the Klein bottle and all these quote unquote paradoxes of in was out and out was in was being demonstrated, he said, well, so too in philosophy, it's about time we talk about place and everything having a place. And then what does that do for our sense of the world, our sense of contradiction, our sense of paradox? And I think that relates to the phrase you used, forgive me, I'm going to mispronounce it because like you said, he had to coin a word, ruliad?
Ruliad.
Ruliad.
R-U-L-I-A-D.
I think that relates somehow. So maybe what are your thoughts to the sense of paradox?
I'm very excited with this idea because to me, one of the difficulties of McGilchrist's idea, I like McGilchrist's idea a lot, but McGilchrist has this idea, and he's not postmodern. I'm not accusing him of being postmodern, but he does have this idea that everything is continuous and that everything is progressing and that everything is in flux basically, and even being is becoming rather than just being. So I guess there are some theological positions that would accept that God is not complete yet and is becoming. I don't know, but I don't know where I feel. I don't know how I feel about that. But anyway, that's one of the things that's always been difficult to me with this idea of this continuous gradation of any binary, where there's all this space for thought and openness and creativity and everything. This idea of this continuous space always felt a little uncomfortable to me because it could so easily fall over into the postmodern idea that everything is relative, right? But when you said place, I think what you're actually saying, if I'm interpreting it right, I think you're talking about context.
I might be. It's new for me because he's using it in a peculiar fashion. He's trying to set the problem he set for himself, and I'll be brief about this because I think it attaches to how you're using the word incompleteness at this juncture. He's responding to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, who in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason said he was given an exposition of space and time. And he said, we don't find space in, we find space out. And that is a project of things being extended. So when cars rush by, we're more or less seeing the phenomenon of extension. And we could cut it up, and we do cut it up all the time. But time is not actually out there. Zeno's paradox of when you shoot the arrow, when does it land? Well, it lands, but it's okay to say that. But when we try to talk about it, which is the same thing as giving an account of it at each of its points, we find that what we're really stuck with is a bunch of still frames. And then the problem becomes, well, how is the one arrow separate from all those many still frames of the arrow? And with technologies that replicate and copy, it's as if we're seeing extended bodies showing us that very problem of locating in time something. So Kant said, time isn't out there. Extended bodies are out there. Time is in the subject. So when we dive into our psychology, when we recount the past, we're not doing anything out there. We're, as it were, sitting for the movie of our own disposition, and that is time. Never extended. Well, that was uneasy for people. And a mark of the transcendentalists up through Hegel was, okay, then is there a clean cut from space and time altogether? That can't be, because we live in a world. We grow up and die. We have relationships that grow or fizzle. So surely there is an intimate relation between time and space. There must be. As Hegel was writing the Phenomenology of Spirit, Napoleon was on his way to conquer Prussia. And revolution was in the air. French Revolution, people understood the guillotine would take heads off. The monarchs were being overthrown. This idea of think for yourself and individual liberties was flowering, and also blood was being spilled everywhere. And this chaos, no one knew how to interpret it. Was it time breaking out into space, or was it space being funneled into time right now? People felt that they were now the avatars of what all the past was leading up to. That's how revolutionaries spoke, because they wanted to sell the idea of quit your job, take up a sword and fight. Marxism does this too. And it deals with that kind of language of inclusion, exclusion. Right now, all time needs to be included in this moment. And we need to build up a phalanx and hold up our signs and stand for this. In time and space, they meet here. Unfortunately, though, with the history of the revolutions, they met in violence, inseparably. So Hegel's philosophy of spirit was a philosophy of conflict. And in the latter part of the 20th century, a philosopher named Richard Rorty said that was America. He gave all these lectures. He wrote this book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where he said, basically to mitigate violence, which will inevitably ensue as we become more factious, as we become more discrete, as we give more and more room to idiosyncratic expressions of the self. The way to mitigate the violence of revolution is to figure out rhetorics that will make everyone feel as if they have their own space, where they're safe to express themselves. So the name of the game is to not offend so that we don't eventually have to take up arms. That's where we were left in the 20th century, as I read the analytic tradition in America. But this phenomenological, theological turn is kind of saying, through Jean-Yves Lacoste, yeah, but there's more than space and time out in, perhaps that doesn't have to be the seedbed of conflict. There is this thing which is neither space nor time in our experience of our life in the world, and that is place. We go home to a place. Home and place there, they don't seem to be just synonyms for space, like space at Timbuktu, space on the Swiss Alps, space in God knows where on Pluto. It seems to be valenced differently. And it doesn't seem to be valenced from a government saying, you have your place, they have their place. As long as we don't offend each other, our places can live in harmony. It seems to be a little closer to home behind our eyes. And I think that's where the Pageau brothers come in when they talk about, we have to admit of high and low because we're human beings that stand up straight. So that I feel as if I've almost tried to complete it, but there's still room for incompleteness. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, running through my head is the Wolfram theory. So if I map that over onto what you said, space is the ruliad, and time is time is actually unique for each participant in the ruliad, because time occurs as that participant is updated. As that participant is updated in the choosing of, so each participant or cell, let's call it a cell. If I say participant, it sounds like I mean human beings. I mean, it could be at that level. It could all be at the human level, could all be at the cellular level, could all be at the level of particles and, you know, whatever. Those things, whatever those things are, at whatever level they are. A choice is always being made according to whatever rule is being followed, but all participants at all times have the choice of all possible rules.
Okay.
So it's not just one simple rule being enacted. But the interesting thing that happens is that, well, so going back to what you said, I want to map this first. Space is the ruliad. Time is the updating of the rule. The place that you're talking about is where each participant or particle or whatever it is at that level is located, their node in the overall, right?
Yes.
Because it's their context.
That connects with what you meant by context. Exactly.
Yes,
okay.
yes. And so I'm the observer, whether I'm a particle or a cell or a person, every node is an observer. So all observers have a unique perspective on what's happening in the ruliad. Okay. And
intrinsically, they have their unique perspective intrinsically.
well, that means inside, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And just a quick caveat to that, just this will be less than a minute. And that's important because—
Take your time, Matt. I always learn from you.
Oh, you're good. That's important, though, to note unique perspective, not that it's that unique perspective, sometimes we think of uniqueness compositionally as, in order to be unique, I have to start from the ground up and reinvent the wheel. Only God can do that. The requirement to be unique is not to be God. The requirement to be unique is to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But existence is far richer than one might presuppose because of paradox. So one of the great gifts Zeno gave to the world inadvertently was to show us how valuable existence is, how indestructible existence is. And dare I say, from an Orthodox perspective, when Jesus destroyed death by death, giving us eternal life, how wonderful that is because we exist. Much thought must be given to existence. So Zeno's teacher was Parmenides, and Parmenides came up with a great rhetorical marriage of being and nothing. And he thought, well, being, if we speak of it correctly, we will find that nothing is except being. And if only being is, then there is not nothing. And then he asked you to sit with that. One problem with that is we now no longer know how to give an account of motion, of change, of becoming. Exactly what you said in the beginning. If time and space are continuous, then everything is included from the outset. And if everything is already included from the outset, there is no reason to exist. Which is the same thing as saying there is no reason to do this rather than that. There is no reason to have value. There is no reason for reason. And so in the admission of being, pure being, we lose everything.
So
you might say everything we care about.
So then determinism is built into the idea of the space-time continuum? Would that be correct?
The determination of value that we are willing to move for, that we are willing to
Well, it sounded to me like what you were saying is the determination of value or our motivation to move is built into time and space being separate.
Yeah. And especially on the discreteness of the space, because the discreteness allows, if you would allow me the analogy, of narrative unfolding of you and of me and of this friendship. Becoming, in other words, Zeno, through all his arguments, which were aimed at showing the absurdity of any logic of change or development or evolution. He wanted to make anyone who said something that required in it the concept of motion, movement, change, effort to be absurd. He was the first nihilist. But his point was to say, because my teacher Parmenides is absolutely correct. And it was kind of a way of saying, don't worry, don't even be happy, because you are. But no one can live that way, because that's not the way reality unfolds itself. Reality unfolds itself. And so we have to give an account of how incompleteness can lie ahead of us as the future, but still be so amenable to reception of us following the rule and choosing a rule to follow. The barber's paradox encapsulates this perfectly, because it shows the absurdity of adopting Zeno's position on there being no size, no existence, no space, except there is space because it's discrete. And here's the paradox. The barber says, you know what? I'm going to take up a calling in life. I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to shave people. How should I do it? I gotta advertise this. Okay, I'm going to write on a piece of paper a proposition. I will shave everyone who will not shave themselves. Certainly someone's willing to be a Parmenidean and say there is something that I'm not going to do because it already is, namely my long beard. But of course, life is becoming and strange, and I don't want to admit it, so I'll have someone else take care of it for me. So I'll go and pay for change to be done to me passively. Weird way to think about getting your hair cut, but it might be a way to think about getting your hair cut. Well, the barber is shaving that person who will not shave themselves. But then reality bites back and somebody asks, maybe a Socrates, asks the barber, who shaves you? And the barber has to say, I shave myself. Well, according to your proposition up there, so well thought out, then you don't shave yourself because you only shave people who do not shave themselves. But I don't shave myself. Well, then you shave precisely yourself. And this break pushes the barber out of his own worldview. And that is something in science nowadays with Vervaeke and others, they're paying attention to. No one can extract themselves out of their theory. Not even Wolfram. He cannot extract himself out of his theory. And I think that's part of the reason why he's making it so grand, is it has to include the observer because the barber's paradox, because of incompleteness.
Well,
that's all I want to say.
One of the things I admire about what Wolfram is doing is that he sincerely cares whether or not he's getting, I don't want to say getting it right, because I don't think that's his approach. He sincerely cares whether or not he has adequate I can't say what he sincerely cares about, but he is talking to all kinds of people. He's talking to biologists and biochemists and chemists and economists, and he's trying to understand how all these different domains of knowledge function, or what they know at this point about these domains of knowledge, about how they function, because he wants to see if they map into this system that he's coming up with. And when he talks, I mean, I want to say something about this context issue, because like I said, one of the things that's always bothered me about the idea of the continuums of the binaries, because it's lovely to talk about and say, oh yes, this, you know, we don't want to be either this or that. We want to be the thing between. We want to, you know, fill this space. We want to have all this deep understanding of each other and all of that. That's lovely. But if we fall over into postmodernism or over into relativism, or if we put ourselves, at least if we endanger ourselves in that direction, I think that's a very negative outcome. So what is it that distinguishes? I mean, when I first started down this road, I used to say context is everything. And I said that for a reason, because in art, there are many ways in which the context is one of the very most important principles. But context can't be everything, because if context is everything, then Foucault and Derrida are 100% correct in everything that they said. Mm-hmm. And yet everything that they said has resulted in this catastrophe.
The barber would be lost.
Not everything.
Context is everything.
Hmm?
The barber would be lost if context was everything.
Yeah.
Because he wouldn't be able to shave himself or shave himself. Mm-hmm. He'd be the servant of his own proposition that pinned him against the world in this cycle that repeats itself and ends itself and swallowing itself. Keep going, keep going.
Yeah, and
that's
so
postmodernism in a nutshell.
Yeah, and so that's the problem with completeness. That's the problem with trying to have diversity, equity, and inclusion, and including everything in the space, because you fall over into this relativistic immobilization, okay? So then how does this work with art, where we have these principles of design, each of which is in some sense is a binary? The elements of design are just to remind people, the elements are the parts that the painting is made up of, like the lines or the sizes of things or the shapes of things, the color of things. That's what makes up the painting. or that's the how you could describe the painting. But, and of course, then there are the materials like the paint and the tools that you use and all of that. But then there are what you call the principles, and the principles are what create interest. So one principle, not only interest, the principles are what create interest and balance and uniqueness, okay, and flexibility. So let's say one principle is repetition. Well, if you were all the way at one end of the binary and you just repeated everything endlessly, all you'd have is just, a pile of dots on a paper and they'd all be identical, right? Mm-hmm. Or a bunch of circles and they'd all be identical and they would all just be repeated. That wouldn't be very interesting. But if on the other end you have nothing repeated and everything is discrete and different and unique and nothing is repeated, then it's just chaos. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in between there's a choice. For every work, that place on the line is going to be at a different place. So repetition is one example. Balance is another example. If you have a teeter-totter, do you have the ball all the way out at the end, or is the ball right in the center, or is it somewhere in between the center and the end? Right? For every work, the choice is going to be at a different spot. If I'm talking about color and I'm talking about whether the painting is predominantly warm or predominantly cool, on every painting, that place on the line is going to be at a different place. So if you start adding up all the possibilities of all the different places on the line that these decisions can be made, you end up with amazing flexible complexity that allows for all possible rules, right? And all possible relationships. But each one of those was a choice of some place on that line. So the choice is a discrete spot, but all those discrete spots can connect together in one place and create something that's entirely unique for that moment and that context. And then the next work will have a completely different set of choices and commitments that were made to create another completely unique thing. And the choices that are made usually depend on the context that the artist is in, maybe the time of day, maybe the way they're feeling, maybe the way the light is streaming in the window, can be influenced by any number of things, right? But so you end up with this really computationally irreducible result, but it comes out of a computationally reducible process. The process has to be reducible. Otherwise, the artist is immobilized. So what the artist does is to limit their choices in the beginning so that they can move forward in these limited choices. But while executing the limited choices, all these other unlimited possibilities become a part of the field that they're working in. And this is why I like his theory so much, because one of the things he says is, so at each node, the choice has to be made of what to do next. And that choice is just based on the relationship with the neighbors that you're next to. But you have a choice amongst all possible rules. Each rule has a different commitment to the neighbors. So it depends on which choice you make at any node. But when you make that choice, sometimes here it's like a branching. The ruliad is like, it starts at a place and then it keeps growing and growing and growing, and it's all branching out all here. If you can imagine, at some place, let's say at one of these nodes, it branches off and goes this way, and the other part of that node maybe branches off and goes this way. someday they'll actually start branching this way and end up together down here again. So it's possible to get off the road and then get back on the same road again. I like that picture too.
And in that regard, even having what you stepped off from and the error inherent therein to be the very means by which you catch your train, so to speak, at the end point of the proper line.
Yep. That's
And
exactly
that not being a leap into the irrational absurd, but a grace note of the dimensionality.
Yep, that's exactly it. That's exactly it, Matt.
So repentance can be al dente with this, can be to the teeth. This can actually, I mean, what you described is phenomenologically the case every minute of our lives.
Well,
Like you never strayed into, as Peterson would say, right? We're supposed to tell the truth or at least don't lie. And I'm not saying it was a question of telling the truth or lying. Never was there a reach for a fabrication to make something color just right in how you said it so that I could have a short circuit to some plausibility. You simply let it, dare I say again, unfold, and it was quite natural, and I followed. I didn't follow every single word, but I followed the pattern that you were developing. And I saw the similitude of using the principles of design with the incompleteness rule 11 or 100 or 30 or whichever he had said, and that you showed on the computer. I saw how they could interface. And so we were actually meeting. There was no lie, and there was no anxiety about, are we telling the truth? It was authentic discourse.
yeah, I mean, I feel like we're communicating.
Right? I mean, but notice how easy it was if we could go meta for a moment. Notice how just natural it was. We were in a zone of proximal development, to riff now on the incompleteness. We were straining outside of our comfort zone being defined as how we normally use words, either in our head or with other people. But we weren't going far left field into woo territory for the sake of sounding higher. We were just kind of taking our elbow off the table and letting the other person see it, and then seeing what the other person would do in response. It's quite exhilarating.
There is something really exhilarating about really trying to unfold what's in your own mind and have somebody else grasp it and kind of fold it back up and internalize it. You know, it's very exhilarating.
And I think it speaks to this technology again of the internet, of easy to access video technology that can make the broadband channel productively infinite. It's similar to, as Jordan Peterson pointed out, the boom of the movable type in the printing press, which created a superabundance of this static page with paragraphs. Yes, we lost the beautiful calligraphy of making that W at the first word of the chapter huge, with snakes around the W and trees and palms and blah, blah, blah. We went straight to the quote unquote alphabet and the meaning of the proposition and the commas and the clauses. And it required a textbook by Erasmus where he could call it On Copia of Words and Thought. And all the students after the printing press were taught, here are 200 techniques, similar to the principles of design, for amplifying your subject, for diagnosing a predicate to the subject and then amplifying that with catalog and with definition and with similitude and then with substituting a description for a name and then back again. Here's how Cicero did it. And we know Cicero did it that way because the printing press gave us all these copies of his orations. Don't listen to the oration, just read it and commit it to memory and then riff on it. That was republished over 100 times in Europe. It was a major success, and it was pedagogical in spirit and aim. But now with this technology, we're finding different affordances, but also in the midst of those affordances, we're finding, what was that word you used? Layers of computational reducibility that we simply could not see in the paragraphs of the printed press. It's like the color spectrum. Our eyes are adapted to certain wavelengths, we might say, certain movements, certain intervals of paradox, of extremes that fold together to give us red of the rose petals. But if we adopt certain technologies, we might be able to see different color schemes, or not color in the sense of we're accustomed to seeing uniform brightnesses, but we'd have to think of color because we're experiencing color in a different way. So too, this affordance is allowing a computational reducibility that we have yet to, I think we're beginning to name, but we're also beginning to exploit in the same way an artist would exploit their media or medium.
I couldn't agree more, because what happens for me when I'm just free associating while I'm listening to videos is that I see patterns that I would not see if I was reading the stuff. The pattern becomes just very obvious to me as I'm listening. And the weird thing is, I'll be listening to something in one arena and I'll just randomly, just for kind of mental relief, I'll pull up some other thing. And that other thing is like, oh my gosh, that fits right in here. This is exactly what I needed. But I wouldn't have known how to find that if I was at the library looking in the Publisher's Weekly or something, trying to figure out what was available to meet that need. Never would have found it. But because of this, it's all floating out there, and then the patterns arise, and then you, well, this is how that fits with that. And
notice when you go into a library, it's an artificial environment, because if you were to take the library seriously, you would think the world then is convertible to a series of hallways with hardback leaflets. Is that the world? It's a strange thought. It's kind of like saying our dwelling is four walls and a roof. In a way, that's more correct than the world is convertible to a series of hallways with hardback leaflets. But it's still, in comparison to today's affordances, a gross approximation. And so, yet we run into that idea of, as you mentioned earlier, the chaos of all the choices, sans rule. But once we arrive at, and once we admit that we are already in a rule paradigm, that we're operating if then within, but then we can also at any moment repent, turn, trope, to use a word from Erasmus in rhetoric studies, to trope, to turn into another rule set and begin the if-then steps, but then maybe kind of leverage those two rules and your memory of the past rule and some gains you made by taking some steps therein to cluster in expression or in visual media discoveries of kind of the half-life in the second rule from the first rule's steps wearing off in the participant of the new paradigm. It's kind of like what happens when someone shares their story. They're giving you the half-life decay rate of what they did in that if-then paradigm back then. Maybe it will allow us to, it will give us hope to keep going in our current if-then, or it will challenge us to trope it out of this situation. It's kind of, it's leaning into what discourse does for people, especially because often when people tell their stories, they'll say, and then it happened, a moment. I got clarity for an action that then led me in this other direction. It's as if they were able, sub specia aetonai, to see that they were making that avalanche of slopes, because they had run through that rule 150 times. And now they were going to adopt a new practice, or maybe simply seeing the picture was big enough. Maybe it gave them hope to keep going. I think certainly in religious context, people avail themselves existentially of this kind of thing all the time. They have to go deeper, they say. It was enough for me to attend the sermons, but now I need to go deeper and I read, or I need to go deeper after reading and I need to adopt an ascetic practice, or I need to acknowledge my guardian angel. And all these things, like, they tend to not explode. Sometimes they do, and the people completely lose their mind, we might say, but maybe they can come back. But it's the danger. It's the danger of becoming more sophisticated. They have to find people, as it were, further down the if-then chain to let them know there is still reality here.
Well, and I mean, I think that happens, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think that has to happen through action, right? It's when we live out, we develop certain beliefs, and then when we live out those beliefs, then we begin to find out, am I on the right track? Am I on the wrong track? And when we live out those beliefs in community, then we help each other navigate whether we're on the right track or the wrong track. And there are at least two ways in which that happens: when the past kind of catapults forward into our present to show us this big aha moment. Oh, now I see where I need to be going forward. But there's also another way in which, Peterson's always talking about falling into chaos, or if you're going through some sort of pain or suffering, or you've just come out of a valley or something, quite often you'll get a big aha moment that will explain to you what you did in the past, because maybe you don't even know what it was you did, or how you did it, or how you ended up where you are. But you'll get a new vision of what all the meaning of that was based on the learning that you get in the moment. So it can go this way or it can go this way, right? Yes. But I wanted to say something here regarding, partly regarding Wolfram's theory, but trying to navigate over to your original topic. You wanted to talk about naming and necessity. But somewhere in the middle of this thing is forgetfulness and memory, and the role of forgiveness, and how that all relates to entropy.
Absolutely.
Right? And
yeah, where do you want, I would ask you, would you please set the, would you bring us to critical speed and then set us on cruise control, and I'll try to weave what I can weave together. But before it's bumpy, I don't really think I can knit the patch together. So maybe you have to hit us up to speed so we can take off. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not sure I can do this, but I had written some notes earlier on this. And as I told you, I can't find the notes I wrote. So there you go. But I was thinking about the role of entropy in regards to space and time. If we take Matthieu Pageau's idea that space is discrete and time is continuous, and time, so space is where all the construction of order takes place, and that requires work. And time is the place of uncertainty, and it's the place of, I guess you could call it disorder. You could call it order and chaos, maybe space and time, order and chaos. But when work is done, that increases entropy somewhere in the universe. So when work can only get done when choices are made, and choices can only be made when there is incompleteness. So there's something about this idea that choices being made to make something, to bring something into order, and Peterson would align that with the speaking of truth, that if your choices always align with truth, you will be bringing into order that which is good. Okay? But as you do that, that kind of offloads entropy into the universe. Now, in my mind, there's something very big behind that. It's almost as though God is willing to accept the increase of entropy, the increase of disorder, and entropy is also really the arrow of time, the movement of time, in order to allow us this opportunity to create something and to work and to make order over here. So one of the other ways that Glenn explained entropy to me is that it's a kind of forgetfulness, because if you think of it in terms of computation, or you think of it in terms of Shannon information, Shannon entropy, a computer, if it doesn't have some place to forget some of what it already has in it, gets all jammed up because it has too much stuff in it. It has to offload some of that. And so that's the forgetfulness side of it. And there's a part of me that wonders if that forgetfulness is not somehow connected to forgiveness. Because, you know, in the scripture, it talks about how he buries our sins in the sea, you know, and our sins are as far as the east is from the west. That's how far they are from us, and that's how grand his forgiveness is. So maybe I'm a little bit wacko in the head, but in my mind, there's something going on there, that entropy is somehow something bigger than just a thermodynamic measurement process.
Absolutely. I feel that most of what I'll say is commentary to what you said and sublimation towards it, because I don't have anything against it. So I'll amplify it in the rhetorical sense of adding copious examples. To pun on the entropic, to take away the prefix en and look at the trope. It's a Greek word that means turn. So many things trope. A leaf in the wind tropes, the plastic bag in American Beauty troped, and that was a symbol of the movie for the nihilistic, capitalistic, wandering bureaucrat that was the American with no frontier to claim. These are tropes that we can identify with for some time, or rather, because time is continuous, that is to say, time finds itself trailing off into an unknown, into an edge that falls over. Rather, we find tropes that we can be with for a while, as if in the same place. In one sense, we're always with these tropes all the time, because time shoots through everything. It's continuous. But when we act, we stabilize a turn. We become figured. We've made up our mind, we say. We're figura. We're no longer reflecting. We are enacting. And that manifests itself as discrete, because it has now a beginning and will end in its purpose. Like, simple example, I'm going to send a piece of mail. That's a story, because I got to go to the post office. Before I do, I need something to send, so I'll write a letter. a micro story in the story, beginning of the letter to the end of the letter, the last period. Now I need to fold it, which is kind of an exterior of the writing, into a technology that I'm putting in an envelope and I'm licking, and then I'm walking to the post office. And once I've turned my back to that blue box, at that moment, I've left the trope. I've left that if then. In fact, if I turn around and trope back into it, I become a comic figure. Ridiculous. Trying to fit my hand in that little gap that won't fit. Reality is saying you don't think you can't do what you think you can do right now because the story's over. That rule no longer applies. Now it's the rule of faith, letting the systems take over. Kind of forgetting about it. Let that letter go. Someone else will pick it up. Someone else will drive in a car and tell their own story about its narration to the destination. And all of that is happening over there because of you deciding, I'm going to send a letter. So in a real way, that entropy over there with all those other actors, having been forgotten by you, unless you're neurotic and you're pitching a tent beside that blue box saying, I want it back. It's like in our own way, just through reality, we show ourselves up as comic figures or as figures capable of moving in different figurations of reality. We don't need the Greeks to tell us this in their plays. We're already enacting tragedy and comedy. That's how reality lays itself out according to these rules. That's what these rules are.
Well, and that is so interesting that you lay it out that way, because that's exactly what entropy indicates. Entropy indicates that time cannot go backwards. Because of entropy, time can only go forward. So you put the letter in the mailbox, it's over, it's on its way. You can't go back again. But there are a lot of us that would park by the mailbox and say, I want it back, I want it back, I want yesterday back again, I want to try again, But yesterday, the old trope, yesterday is gone. And tomorrow is going to come. And
So
that's just the way it is.
So then I think this matters then. So if we see our lives as definitely a play, it's definitely a story. It's definitely better than anything we could watch in Hollywood, that we could read in a book. The best books are tracings of human life, our own lives. It proves to us from a meta vantage point, my entire life until I breathe my last breath is the best thing I'm ever going to experience. Those moments where I want relief and I go to a movie or I go to a play or I read someone else's work, it's like taking a break from the exercise. But what's the point of the exercise? Why do we exist? And if Kant was right, and the continuous time is in here, not out there is the extended objects, the blue mailbox, the letter, the mailman, the recipient. In here is, okay, am I going to be content with the fact that there is a mailing system? Am I going to be content with the fact that I could go home and do some other things? Am I content with the fact that I can range over all these possibilities and not dissipate? Can I bear that load? Can I bear becoming the likeness of my creator, not just his image? Then we start to see that the real fireworks in action and joy is in the invisible region of the heart, the inside. That does change, that does manifest, that does grow in proportion to how we trope out there. Because Jesus said, it's not what enters the body that defiles it, but what exits. Because in the heart is where all the great tragic actions happen. The lusts for power begin and end. It's just the dying expression of an artifact when it comes out of your mouth in the judgment of a brother or sister. all the things that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky strained their neck and right arm to trace has already happened in that spiritual realm, we might say, in that invisible immensity, which is larger than the universe of material reality, because it's where all those rules are accessed and chosen before you lift a finger, right? So consciousness, people are talking about consciousness, and consciousness never being extractable, like vanilla extract, never being extractable from the world we live in. Well, that's true, but that also would mean then that consciousness is bigger than any discrete moment that we act through. The inside, you said this in an email to me. It's as if at some place in history, this major trope occurred, this major turning, where the inside was somehow pushed into the outside. It was turned outside, inside out. But it's false, because the inside is so much bigger than the outside, you would never be able to get it all the way out if we're made in the image and possess the potential to enact the likeness. I would like some supplements.
Well, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, because you're my philosopher informant, okay? So when you talk about Kant in this way, what I hear, I have not studied Kant, and the way I usually hear Kant discussed is that he was the turning point in when things started to become a catastrophe, leading into the Enlightenment and creating all the problems that we have today. So what part of what you just said is problematic about Kant, and what part of what you just said is right about what Kant said?
Well, in my opinion, these last 2,000 years have been a great geography of the soul, if you want to think about it that way. St. Gregory Palamas, in about 1300 AD, in the Triads, a book, defended hesychastic prayer, the prayer of stillness. And in one of his arguments, he made the statement, which was the basis for attack from the transcendental idealists, starting with Kant and ending in Hegel. And this was the argument. As we ascetically rise, as we turn from the sensuous pleasures, as we restrict ourselves from just falling into any if-then conditional, but if we become more awake to the choices we have in front of us and what they mean, and then have the courage to stick to them and move forward. In fact, we go through the common cups of coffee, the common biting of the lips so I don't judge my brother and say something I'll regret. We go through the material to the spiritual. We go through knowing, and we go through not knowing. Because when we reach the angels, when we reach spiritual things, when we see uncreated light, when we let out the demon in the heart and Jesus comes, what we know and what we experience is beyond knowing and unknowing. It doesn't take part in Zeno's dialectic of negation or position. It's beyond unknowing. You can't even not know it. And he said it's not one thing, it's many things. Just like when you wake up in the day and you open your eyes and the sunlight filters through the window and you say, there are many possibilities unfolding before me as my eyes open. I can get up on the right or the left side of the bed. I can get up at the bottom. I can make a cup of coffee. I can make a pot of tea. I can make some eggs. I could forego it. I could do, you know what? Wow, I could actually take care of my taxes today. All these possibilities unfold. When consciousness wakes up, it doesn't wake up to one thing. It wakes up to many. In the same way, beyond knowing and unknowing, many things are experienced. And we have to be still, because you never leave your body, but it's a common occurrence. And it's supposed to be the norm for a human being.
What's supposed to be what is supposed to be the norm?
We're supposed to rise above the oatmeal of materialism. We're supposed to also rise above the wine of negation, the way of the negative, via negativa. God is not this, he's not that. We're supposed to rise, even though that's wine, it's good vintage, we're supposed to rise above that, which has also risen above the oatmeal of materialism. We're supposed to know God and the angels and everything. And it's supposed to be beyond knowing and unknowing, and it's supposed to be normal. It's supposed to be normative, not exceptional, just normative.
Well, so then where did Kant come in that?
Yeah, so that was the statement of normativity. That was supposed to be our morals. That was supposed to be just everyday life. As Jonathan Pageau would say, we shouldn't have to explain symbols. It just should be a way of life. It's normal.
Well, look, I just need to clarify. Now, you were talking about St. Gregory of Palamas, and were you using him because it sounded like you were just describing what he said, but then you said that was what Kant said. Was it the same thing?
So as the wise man Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. The same rules are presented to everyone in history. Mm-hmm. It's what we do that matters, what we choose. Mm-hmm. So Palamas chose something according to what the rules put before him. Kant was given the same rules. What he chose, in my opinion, is slightly different. He didn't want to say, because for some reason he liked Newton's absolute time and space idea. He liked the idea that you could put a pencil on paper and never lift it. You could explain everything by recourse to the metaphor of an unbroken line. Mm-hmm. So he said, you know what's normal? What's normal is I have no idea what anything means. It's just extensions of bodies in time, in here, where I grow up, and I adopt views, I let views go, I adopt views, I let views go, I adopt views, I let views go. And I develop a categorical imperative where hopefully it's universal enough that everyone else in my position would also make the same choices, and we can live in a nice town together where we're not stepping on each other's toes. But that doesn't require you to be ascetic. It just requires you to, I don't even know what it requires you to do. And that's probably why it broke down and why materialism is breaking down. It doesn't give you a clear ascetic path. It doesn't tell you why everything's good, but why we should seek the higher things. It confuses everything.
So would you say the distinction between the two might be courage?
Yeah, I mean, because when we encounter God, we encounter, as C.S. Lewis would say, not a tame lion. We suffer. Learning is suffering. And I don't mean that as we're bloody, we're worthless, we're just bowing our head in servitude. No, suffering is doing a push-up. Suffering is eating something you've never tried before and tasting it for the first time and having all the glands say, wow, that's what sourness is. But lifted to an even higher level, being able to sit in a room and quietly pray. In our day and age, that's an encounter, that's an experience. That's hard to do. And I'm not trying to sound like this conservative who's buckling down, but like,
oh no, but I mean, some of the most beautiful praise music talks about the sacrifice of praise. Lifting up your voice to the Lord is executing the sacrifice of praise. Plus, I mean, the whole idea of suffering, that word in scripture is also passion, which has more than just the meaning of what we think of suffering as, like, you know, whip yourself on the back or something, or get bloodied and bowed, as you said. But suffering also means to permit,
yes,
to receive into you, to make space in yourself for something else. And so all learning in that sense is suffering, because you have to let go of something in order to let something else new in, right?
Yep. In fact, and it makes the propositional very crust, right? Because if one accepts the fact that as our bodies are mostly water, they say, if most of our being is reception of God, because we're in the image of God, then the explaining of things in little toys that people can rearrange and manipulate and throw onto things, it becomes this, I mean, I don't even know what to call it. It's just very thin. But so much of how people make money and so much of how wars are, I mean, just so much, it's the enemy, right? Wanting to make the lesser the greater. This thing, which is so small, is what's constantly propagandized, that we think it's everything. Whereas the thing that's everything, we think it's so small. Something you could put in your pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And yet all the gains are in not this thing, but that thing. And
My turn.
yeah, I mean, that's all. I've hit a wall. I don't know what to say beyond that.
I thought you were in the middle of a sentence, so I didn't want to interrupt you.
Mm-mm.
So I took some notes from the emails that you and I had been bouncing back and forth about this concept that you wanted to talk about related to Saul Kripke's book, Naming and Necessity. And one of the things that you said, discussing the whole thing about Zeno and his paradoxes and how immobilizing they were, you said phenomenologically, no one lives as if they might approximate anything to infinity. That is typically called neglect or a series of compromises. Now, I thought that was a real interesting leap to make. I understood the first half of the sentence, that no one lives as if they might approximate anything to infinity. Because if we start trying to do that, then we're trying to live in this continuous space, this complete space. And it's phenomenologically and every other way impossible, because there's too many choices to be made in that space and we get immobilized. So something needs to limit our space. But when you were talking about this, you said that is typically called neglect or a series of compromises. What's the connection there with neglect and compromise?
Yeah, so I want to use the parable of the sower and Psalm 1 to make a word picture for it. So the parable of the sower is that we are seed. And when we go into the ground, when we enter earth, when we become conscious, we begin to unfold. We begin to go through the if, then, right, left, one foot in front of the other story of our lives. And at the end, we have fruit. Along the way, we also have fruit. Psalm 1 talks about, dare I say, it talks about Jesus Christ. It's about Jesus. But since he took our nature, and I have human nature that he took, I can also identify with it. Psalm 1 gives the description of consciousness of that seed in the parable of the sower as it's growing. And it doesn't say that the person was a gladiator, but it says that they delighted in the law of the creator of the universe. So they didn't invent the law. They delighted in the pre-established harmony. Now that delight, it doesn't say it was efficacious, because the Lord knows the path of the righteous at the end of that psalm. They had a path while they're also being compared to a tree with firm roots planted. So which is it, stability or motion? Well, it's not a problem for the psalmist, because it's not a problem in the parable of the sower, because it's not a problem for creation. And yet when we think we're above it, then we start to think, okay. A friend of mine said, oh, I really need life insurance, Matthew. I need it for my wife. I need it for my future. It's like, that's a nice thought, but I mean, he's my age. He's worried that tomorrow he's going to pass away. It bled into a sort of beautiful paranoia in its scope and panorama. And he and I joked about it, that it was immensely prideful because we don't know the day or the hour. And then we think on top of that, we can make the right series of steps to take care of everything. So it's as if we never existed and the people around us will just carry on. It's such a strange hatred of oneself. I want to live so that I can afford a life insurance plan. It's such a weird thing to say, to like really give a lot of energy and time to. I mean, sure, it's fine, I guess, but like to make that the tree is and that will bear its fruit. It's a strange inversion. So using that as an object lesson, the thought that we can just, I know I'm supposed to commune with the creator of the universe. I know I'm supposed to pray. I know I'm supposed to reach these spiritual heights. I know that's possible. And it's supposed to be normal for human beings. I shouldn't have to go to a library or get a PhD or make up this hodgepodge of stuff and just accept it and convince myself that it's really good and an approximation too. I shouldn't have to, instead of doing the theosis, buy a life insurance plan and really think about that and get my life insurance plan and like say that that's what it means to be a man and that's what it means to be a good provider for the world. That's normal, Matt. And anybody who doesn't do that, they I mean, I don't know how they look at themselves in the mirror. It's like if you kind of gave that thing like 0.1% of your energy, it would be a really good thing. But all of that energy you should actually put into this thing because it's much more noble and it's actually dignified of the human being. As man was not made for the Sabbath, I don't think we're here for our jobs. I mean, jobs, like everybody's going to work. But the great conceit is that we're made to have our jobs. That's our status. That's the thing we should defend. But that's the very thing we're constantly asked to give up by Christ. In the gospel, not to be crazy people out in the wilderness, but we're supposed to be ascetic. Not because the world is bad, but because we're supposed to be normally living out our lives in these spiritual achievements. But when we don't do that, we fill it up with the life insurance plans and the jobs and whatever else materially we might happen to fill it up with. That's neglect of the weightier matters of the law. And it's manifests itself as a series of, yeah, I could have really done that thing that was solitude and stillness and actually hard for me, actually required courage. But instead, I went on this tirade about life insurance or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's the compromise part.
Yeah, so I see a third way. You can take care of the job and the life insurance by just acting upon it at the moment it occurs to you rather than allowing it to consume your bandwidth in your mind because you have put it off and haven't done it, right? So part of it is the desire to make it into a big deal. And the way that we do that is by procrastinating and putting it off and using it as an excuse for why we're not accomplishing something. But if you just make the choice and take care of it, and as a wife, I can tell you, I feel very peaceful knowing that my husband has an insurance policy. And if he didn't have one, I wouldn't feel very peaceful. So yes, I would like to be a person who says, well, I know God will take care of me, whether my husband has an insurance policy or not. And I do know the truth of that, but maybe one of the ways that God takes care of me is by telling my husband to get me an insurance policy, right?
And not exalting it to your point.
Right, not exalting it, right? But my husband needs
that's inaccessible and you can't actually do in an hour. of a day or something.
Right. I mean, he can just act on it, put it aside. He doesn't have to think about that anymore. Everybody needs to have a job because those who don't work should not eat. That's what the scripture says. So the job is important, but the job can't consume all of your bandwidth all the time, because you need bandwidth to be in that space with the Lord. And the way I see the ascetic side of it is that it's not as though the ascetic side of it is an accomplishment in itself. It just, that is what releases us to be open to the Lord. It cleans out the spaces, if you will. When I get out of control with snacking takes the place of God. I don't, it's not only that it takes the place of God, but it occupies my mind and my hands and my mouth in such a way that I don't have time to contemplate the deeper things. But when I'm not snacking and when I'm being ascetic in terms of food, I have time to contemplate the deeper things and to be at peace and to pray and all of those things. So that's kind of the way I see that. But now I do understand what you meant when you said neglect. Here's the thing about the way you write, Matthew, and I think it's great, but I've heard it said before that Nietzsche could write a whole book in one sentence. And sometimes I feel like that's what you're doing. You compress so many ideas down into one sentence, and in your own mind, you know what you're saying, but all those ideas are so compressed that when I read the sentence, I can't follow your line of thinking to get at that place until I ask you. And then I ask you, and then you open it up and it's like a rose blooming. It's just the neatest thing.
Neat. Well, thank you, Karen.
So I sometimes wonder if maybe you should write a book where first you write the book. Here's the thing about maps of meaning that's so interesting, is that maps of meaning is written in such a way that by the time you get to the last two pages is the whole book. And when you read each sentence in the last two pages, a whole chapter of the book will open up to you with every sentence. So like while you're reading it, you get this automatic head summary of the whole book while you read the last two pages. But wouldn't it be interesting to write a book that starts with those two pages, yes, where it's this complex, compact data compression thing here, and then each chapter is one of these sentences opens up a whole chapter, and then you explain what it was you were thinking to the reader.
No, absolutely. And I'm actually thinking about that. So it's neat how you brought it up. It's like our two paths crossed. For the last 2 weeks, I've been reading the textbook by Erasmus, published around the 1500s, on rhetoric and how to amplify a subject, to identify its predicate and then catalog from it. And he identifies different rhetorical techniques. One thing he says is an interpretation is an exercise best left off the pulpit and in the study. Because what he meant by interpretatio was an exercise of taking one sentence and saying it the same way while substituting all the words for different words 200 times, let's say. So you would get 200 sentences out of one with no change in idea. That was the goal. Because back then, of course, they separated rhetoric from logic. They thought ideas were discrete, we might say, and rhetoric is continuous. There were many more words than ideas. And so when you wanted to be copious as opposed to concise, you would just take a few ideas, tradition, in other words. You would take what was the context for most people, most of the time, and then you would bloom it with all these words, and the art was not to induce tedium in the listener, but to find a way to vary at the right time with difference so that they were never bored, but were willing and excited to give attention to this luxury of language, not a overabundance complexity of idea. Because the goal of the rhetorician, according to Erasmus, and I think this is true and it marks your point, it's not to come up with a new idea on every page or on every paragraph, God forbid, every other sentence. No, who could handle that? Who could take that? Not even computers do that. They content themselves with zeros and ones. Even computer language has a tradition, binary. What people really want, and I think this is one of the reasons why people read less and less fiction. I have a theory. As people get older, they read less and less fiction, not because they want to read less and less fiction, but because, and Charles Dickens is an example of this, fiction only grows where there is a seed bed. And seed beds are tradition. So a reading culture can only exist in a tradition where everyone knows the normal course of life and can aspire to the normal course of life, and therefore can find themselves somewhere along the road of this normal course of life. If you have that simplicity, those rules of design, to quote you from earlier, and it's true for almost everybody, that's a culture, then you can have great geniuses come and copiously endow the culture with exempla and illustrations and digressions, not of ideas, because that would be to create a new culture, a subculture, a contradiction and counter-revolution. And people are weary of that, and they should be. That's the stranger, to use the Pageauian brothers' terms. Instead, they're beautifying and they're celebrating the tradition by copiously retelling it. So yes, that's one of my aspirations. And it's to do it with a particular story in the Orthodox tradition. There are two great stories in my mind of the Orthodox tradition. One of what happened when Jesus died and went to Hades. And he recovered Adam and Eve and everyone else. And like a lightning bolt, he went down, and like a train of the bride, he carried them all forward, out in love. Harrowing of Hades, it's a beautiful icon. It would also be it would demand all the resources of language, every language. It would be the beautiful Tower of Babel, which can never be constructed because it already happened. But it would be a beautiful ambition to try to tell that thing copiously. But the second one is a little more manageable. It's the story of repentance of Saint Zosima and Saint Mary of Egypt. And if you look at the two icons side by side, they're similar in design. Because the one is the story of death being swallowed up in death, and of our nature finding out that no matter how long we search, we'll never find death. It's not under that stone, it's not behind that closet door. We'll never find death. It's gone. It's in God, swallowed up, dead. We'll never find it. So we better take our normal spiritual eternity seriously and beautify ourselves, because we can't brush it all underneath the rug. It's never going away. We'll never die. But the second story, which is almost an answer to that problem, how then do we repent, and how courageous can we be with our repentance? How deep can we go? Is the story of Saint Zosima and Saint Mary of Egypt, which I won't tell here, but it's a simple story. It's something that can be committed to memory. It's a few plot points, but a novelist, and there's been no Shakespeare of this yet, dare I say, can make copious use of that material, because there's so much in it. Every other sentence of the story of Saint Zosima and Saint Mary of Egypt is 100 novels. The world could not contain the story of repentance in those two.
Well, now you got me curious. I'm going to have to look it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Around the 700 AD.
I think we've been going on long enough, but this has been so great, Matt. I really love it. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to point Anne Bridges to this video so she can get a flavor of who you are in case you ever decide to ship your book over to her.
Cool. That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get around to naming a necessity, and I really would like to talk about that one of these days. So maybe we'll do that next time. Because I learned a lot just from reading your notes. So I know it's good stuff.
Thank you for sharing the TOE and your thoughts on it. That was I always love to see what you do with cosmology and cosmogony, the origin of the cosmos. It's marvelous to see.
Well, I'm going to link to his October 19th update of his concept. It's a 3.5-hour video or something, and you don't need to watch the whole thing by any means. You could get a lot out of just the first half hour, but he uses the first hour and 57 minutes to detail the theory.
Okay.
But about a year ago, Michael and I did an episode where we talked about the theory, and I used all the illustrations from Wolfram's website to show how it actually plays out. So I'll put a link to that too, in case anybody wants to watch that and just kind of flesh out where it's coming from. I had a lot of fun in the last hour talking to a biochemist about this theory and how it might work in terms of biochemistry. So that episode will be coming out next week. So, and this one will probably come out next week too, in terms of timing. Okay.
Have a great night.
Thank you so much for your time, Matt. You're always so
Thank you,
gracious
Karen.
in giving me time. So have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
You too.